Me to take the bench. I'm going to go over here and feed. How's that?
Awesome. Sounds great. Sounds great. Thank you so much. And we absolutely love Pastor Dan. Just to encourage him, just show him how much you love him. I have been mentored by some very amazing people, and Pastor Dan Schultz is by far one of those men that have changed my life. There's just been even the experience of going on the road. When he says that we promote the road here at Cross Point, we promote the road. There are things that you don't know that have a hold on you. You go on the road, you figure that out, and you make those things go away. You give them up to Jesus. It's worth going. So, with that being said, Pastor Dan talked me into the road a couple of years ago, and it was one of those conversations where I was like, okay, I guess my boss says I should go to this, so I guess I should go to it. And I was a little bit, well, what am I getting into? And I'm so glad. I'm so glad. If you talk to my wife, you talk to my kids, they're happy that Daddy went on the road. So, this morning, I'm kicking off a series on the life of Elijah. And we simply call it Elijah Turned to God. And I'm going to set the stage for kind of the most memorable point in Elijah's story. It was 400 verse 1. There were 400 prophets of Baal versus one prophet of God. Now, most of the prophets of God that were left alive were hidden away. They were basically keeping away from this wicked queen named Jezebel that had put to death almost every prophet of God before that. And so there were only about a few hundred in the entire nation of Israel. Elijah gets word from the Lord that there's going to be this huge drought in the land. And you can find this entire story in the book of 1 Kings, chapter 18, well, starting at chapter 17, going through from there. But what you find is, during this huge drought, King Ahab, the husband of Jezebel, has the people kind of turn their faith from the Lord to Baal. And they worship this other god, and this process brings violence into the nation. And the worship of Baal by itself is a violent thing, and we'll get into that as we go through the story. But at this point in the story is 400 prophets of Baal against one prophet of God. And they're up on top of Mount Carmel. And there's basically a contest to be had. Elijah says, whoever's God brings fire down onto this altar, that's the one true God. Because what you see is the entire nation of Israel had started to turn away from God also. It wasn't just these prophets, it wasn't just this wicked queen and her husband, but it was the entire nation. So I would imagine that Elijah definitely felt as if the odds were against him. And if you're like me, you have a old saying that you will usually go to when you find difficult things in your life. And the funny thing is that the saying I usually go to because I forget. I forget some very important things about God. And so this is the saying that I will say. I will say, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. This is somewhat attributed to Newt Rockney. Some other people say that it was actually John F. Kennedy's father, Joseph Kennedy, that actually kind of coined this phrase. Either way, this is kind of where I go to in my life. When the going gets tough, the tough get going. Now, keep in mind, I do this not because it's the right thing to do. I do this because I think I'm going to make a difference. I think that it's going to be in my power that I'm going to change the circumstances. This is all based around the fact that I forget. I forget how big God is. Now, the entire story of Elijah, this man was a man whose life was bathed in prayer. He was in constant communication with God. And I set the scene to think, if you've seen the movie The Fiddler on the Roof, there's this great scene in the movie where he's talking to God just in conversation. And he's walking along the road, he's with his donkey, he's constantly talking with God. And his wife Golda yells from their front door, come here, I need you. And he treats her as if she's interrupting their conversation. And he looks up to heaven and he says, I'll talk to you later. And this is beautiful. I love this. I truly believe this is what Elijah's life was like. He was in constant communication with his heavenly Father, who he knew was with him at all times. Whether it be during the time when he had been told that there would be a drought across the entire nation, or it be during the time that 400 prophets of Baal would be against him on Mount Carmel. He knew that God was with him. So I have to ask the question, how big is your prayer? Because if you have 400 angry people against you, I would imagine at that time you would probably pray. I know of a couple different times in my life where I've had some very tense situations, but I can only think of one time in my life where I've actually feared that I might die. My father and I, one of the ways that we would spend a lot of our free time, and the way that we really grew close, was we would go fishing. And I grew up in the thumb of Michigan, and we would go way, way far east on Lake Huron. We went so far, we were in between Michigan and Canada. And we were in not a huge boat, but a small fishing boat, and a storm came up. And this storm was so ferocious that it would rock the front of the boat up almost vertical, and then it would come crashing back down and bring the back end of the boat back up the same height. And my dad would sit on the back end of the boat, and I would sit on the front. And my father, the only time I've ever really seen him worried, with tears in his eyes, at that time, not a man who really followed God, I could tell by what I saw in his eyes that we were in trouble. And so I began to fear. I was probably about 13 years old at this time. I began to fear for my own life. And just like they say there's no atheist in a foxhole, there's no atheist in a boat that's about to sink. I saw at that moment my dad want to be able to offer me encouragement, want to be able to bring me hope. And yet, because of my father's life at that time, he didn't necessarily have that to bring to me. And so I remember in my own heart trying to pray, say, God, if you get us out of this, I don't know what you want from me, but I'll do it, whatever it is. So whether it be this time in your life, or you can think back to another time that the odds were tremendously against you, how big is your prayer? What we know from the book of James is that the author tells us, when you ask, you do not receive, because you ask with wrong motives, that you may spend what you get on your pleasures. James 4:3. Now, granted, my desire was simply not to be hurt. I didn't have a desire to actually do something good for God. I just had a desire not to drown That was all I desired. That's all I wanted at that time. The amazing thing is, when you look at the life of Elijah, he didn't have selfish motives behind the big prayer in his life. What he had motive for was that the nation of Israel would return to God. That was his heart's cry. Not that he would just